The Dragon was slayed a week earlier, but there was unfinished business in Indianapolis for Michigan to take supremacy of the Big Ten for the first time in 17 years. And the questions were answered that no, they did not look past that mission. Wolverines 42, Hawkeyes 3 in emphatic fashion. We've got Steve Deace, Michigan podcast, here to typically explain, deliver, but Steve, I'm going to give you just a second, maybe just to kind of bask and gloat here.
Well, Mark, if you go back to the beginning, during the offseason, I think I told you that I thought this would either be a special season or Harbaugh's last season. And that too many things were new, too many things were reinvented, and it was systemic, right? They weren't just trying a new offense. And so maybe you get off to a slow start while the defense is playing well, but you're not scoring enough points, and then the offense clicks at the end. Everything was new. With Maurice Linguist leaving to become the head coach at Buffalo, seven assistant coaching changes on this staff, new quarterbacks, new schemes on both sides of the ball. And the new coaches we hired, we're not just talking, I mean, these were different people. I mean, nobody on this staff is older than 45. It's one of the youngest staffs in the Power Five. So this was either going to be a great reboot or a desperate grasping of straws that would implode, in obvious fashion. Now, I thought the odds trended heavily towards the latter, unfortunately, but I always did give you that option from the very beginning that we could see this thing kind of become lightning in a bottle. And I said, if that happens, you're looking at a season similar to 1985. That's the last time we had a coach make this kind of adjustments to the program after a disappointing season. And Bo did it after a 6-6 year in 84 with a lot of injuries and didn't have great culture and leadership, just really reinvented the program. The next year they were not in the top 20 to start the year for the first time since Bo's first season in 1969. And they ended up being number 2 in the country against what a lot of people thought was an impossible schedule that year. Notre Dame, South Carolina, Maryland were all ranked in the preseason top 20. That was the non-conference schedule before he even got into Big Ten play. And Jimmy was the quarterback of that team. And I think that what you've seen this year, thankfully, is that the former happened. And to show you that it was real is that it did not happen like instantly. And then they just kind of coasted off of that. This has been a gradual buildup. And you've seen as they get accustomed to one another, the schemes, the execution, the leadership. And so this has been a build that, we're only 2 months away from Michigan getting, outplayed in the second half by Rutgers at home. And now this thing has coalesced and it's catalyzed, and they're the hottest team in the country right now. They're playing the best football of the Jim Harbaugh era. I mean, this is the best football that a Michigan team has played for a long stretch since 2006 under Lloyd Carr, when they started 11-0 before losing to you guys in an epic 1-2 game at the end of the year. So we're going back 15 years now. It's the first outright Big Ten championship for the program in 18 years, 2003. First Big Ten title of any kind since 2004. And what I also find fascinating about this is it's also come full circle. Jimmy was on this trajectory his second year in 2006 or 2016, remember. And then that year ended with disappointment. And the disappointments were they lost to Iowa, they lost to Ohio State, and they've already so this has kind of been the 2016 revenge tour. They beat Iowa, they beat Ohio State, and both those losses were just beyond heartbreaking in the final seconds. And they dominated both of those teams. And now, you remember the bowl game that 2016 team played in, it was the Orange Bowl as a heavy favorite against Florida State, and they lost that game straight up. So there's a lot of serendipity to what is happening here. And on a personal level, as a fan, a lifelong fan, I never thought we'd be here ever again. I mean, I was broken, damaged. I mean, I had kind of become a nattering Martha of a fan. And now I've literally witnessed the college football equivalent of Lazarus come forth. I mean, we were 2-4 at this time last year, canceling games. We had guys opting out, guys getting hurt, guys not wanting to play, awful culture. And now here we are in the college football playoff. And I mean, it's just, it's the first time in the history of the college football playoff, Mark, a team went from unranked to being in the playoff. And it's a team that was unranked in the preseason AP poll and now has a shot to win the national championship.
You were right with your boomer bust prediction. I was wrong. I saw 9-3 talent against a difficult schedule with possible dysfunctionality coming from the 2020 campaign and maybe some assistant coaches misplaced positionally. So I made the safe call at either 7-5 or 8-4. I don't recall. This game against Iowa. Okay, nobody's going to confuse Iowa with the greatest show on turf or anything like that, but still, and they might be the 5th or 6th best team in the league, but 42-3, nobody else is beating Iowa 42-3. This showed maturity coming off the Ohio State game to be able to regroup, get the next mission, and go and complete it.
Yeah, I didn't understand the whole idea that this would be a letdown. It's the Big Ten championship game, okay? For a program that hasn't won a championship since before most of these players were born. That being said, though, this is a situation that the Michigan program's never been in. I mean, you and I grew up in an era where so much was put into that Michigan-Ohio State game at the end of the year that often the winner would go to the Rose Bowl as a heavy favorite and lose. Because even with 3-4 weeks in between games, it was tough to convince those guys that this game is just as important as the one you just played, right? Well, now you got to come back a week later and do that. And Michigan's never faced that before as a program. So I thought from an execution standpoint, there might be a bit of a slow start. The Michigan coaches, I think they fixed that by calling the gadget play with Donovan Edwards early on that led to a big play, putting J.J. McCarthy in early on to run the zone read and to get the numbers advantage in the run game. And that set up Blake Corum's big run. So by setting their team up, because you saw other than those two plays, Michigan offensively did nothing in the first half. So I like the fact that the Michigan coaches provided big play, explosive play opportunity for their players to get ahead, to still kind of get their feet wet and get into the game from a focus and execution standpoint. And then Michigan made another big coaching adjustment at the half. Iowa blitzed and played a lot more man than they typically do. On a week-to-week basis, basically daring Cade McNamara to beat him. Michigan went to a check with me offense for the whole second half. And then you saw how they were able to make a lot of adjustments at the line of scrimmage to help Cade figure out, hey, here's the hot read. Here's where the ball is going to go. And you just saw a different level of offensive execution in the second half. So I think the Michigan coaches, I think the Michigan players get a lot of credit throughout the course of the year. And Harbaugh has said this, for the culture that they put together. And for me as a longtime Michigan fan, I mean, this has always been our best teams, have always been player-led. But I think the Michigan coaches, Mark, get a lot of credit for the blitzkrieging of Iowa. They put a game plan together to try to get some sudden shots to get a lead, because Iowa doesn't like to play from behind. And from that time forward, it was just a bad matchup for Iowa, Mark. I mean, Iowa likes to play in a mosh pit. We do too. We don't mind doing that, but we just do it with a different level of recruit than they get. And we were just too explosive for them all over the field. Too many athletes. Even on Iowa's first drive, there was a thing of beauty, and they should have scored a touchdown on that halfback option. But, I mean, David Ojabo just single-handedly blew that play up on the edge and forced what ended up being a missed field goal. They just don't have explosion like that at Iowa. And I think that was the difference in the game, is that this year, it hasn't always been with the frequency that a lot of us would like. But this year, Harbaugh and his staff have decided to actually take their explosive athletes, and we're not going to turn Rashawn Gary into an anchor. No, we're going to turn Aiden Hutchinson and David Ojabo both loose. We're actually now letting all these big-time recruits that we acquire every year, we're actually putting them in positions to shine rather than conform to a system.
Steve Deace, Michigan Podcast. Folks, if you are not familiar, please put it into the search engine of YouTube right here. Michigan Podcast. Check it out. Go to your favorite audio platform as well if you enjoy your content that way. Steve Deace, Michigan Podcast. So now we have a familiar configuration in the playoffs, Steve, where we have 2 or 3 teams better than 1 or 2 teams. This year, the configuration is 3 clearly better than the one in Cincinnati. Michigan was in line to be given or had earned a number 1 seed. They get leapfrogged by Alabama. Michigan annihilates the number 13 team in the country by 39 points. Alabama, though impressive, was still in a ball game with about 10 minutes left in the game before, pulling away from Georgia. So you got to get through Georgia and Alabama as opposed to a Cincinnati game in round 1. Do you think that was manipulated in some fashion?
I mean, first of all, anytime there's a human element, there's manipulation, Mark. It's just a matter of whether it's justifiable manipulation or not. I mean, I would have voted Michigan number 1. But frankly, it's because to me, I think the resumes of Michigan and Alabama are so close that my fandom then comes into play. I'll remove as much of my fandom in making predictions as I can. But if it's close, then the fandom comes into play. Okay. But I don't really have an intellectual issue. There's only 2 teams that have been ranked number 1 all year, Alabama and Georgia. And Georgia had been really the most convincing number 1 team of the last several years. Even last year when Alabama had a phenomenal team, there was still a lot of talk that Ohio State and Clemson were close to them, with future top 10 NFL draft picks. A couple of years ago with LSU, we really didn't know until they won at Alabama. And then really they lit up, Georgia and Oklahoma leading into the national championship game, that was considered a historically great year. So, those are teams that people think rank with historical greatness. And there were questions going into the postseason about how much, there was of a gap between them and everybody else. That we had no conversations like that about Georgia. I mean, in the back of my mind, I always kind of looked at the list of quarterbacks they were playing every week and wondered what would happen if they actually had to play, a competent to explosive one. But that was that's more of a theoretical analysis where you're kind of looking for an angle, to not be impressed. So I don't have a problem with Alabama taking the team that was a unanimous number 1 for a month and a half and basically taking them behind the woodshed and being ranked number 1 when they were the number 1 team before that. I don't have an issue for it. Obviously, as a Michigan fan, I'd rather play Cincinnati than Georgia and Alabama back to back. But from an analytical standpoint, I don't have an issue with it.
Let's honor this super chat coming in from Emil. Thank you so much for that. We appreciate it. Should Michigan go out and add Joe Brady to the staff?
I think what'll be fascinating is there's a lot of speculation this will be Josh Gaddis's last year in Ann Arbor, one way or the other. And I think that Michigan, if that's the case, that Michigan, even though he's had a great year as OC, that he never intended to be here long term and may be looking at some head coaching jobs around the country, at least at the group of 5 level. And if that's the case, I think Michigan's next OC is kind of a Joe Brady type, but he's already on the staff. And that's Matt Weiss that they brought in to be the quarterback's coach from the Baltimore Ravens. He's the young, good looking dude that you often see standing next to Harbaugh on the sidelines. And he did a phenomenal job mentoring these quarterbacks this year and keeping McNamara and McCarthy together while inserting McCarthy into the lineup to do things that it's obvious Cade cannot do. And yet they didn't seem to really threaten Cade. In fact, the more McNamara played, the better Cade actually ended up playing. I think he's in line to be the next OC at Michigan if and when Josh Gaddis moves on. But of course, you look at what Joe Brady did 2 years ago with that LSU program. If I were Brian Kelly at LSU, that's maybe a phone call I'd be making like yesterday, but without the made up Southern twang.
It was quite amusing for me to even catch on to that. It was pretty obvious. So we'll get back to the playoff matchup against Georgia. And I covered SEC football for 7 years, and I talk to SEC fans nearly every day. So I understand the mindset from most of them is that unless you beat an SEC team, you have yet to prove anything.
And I think they've earned that.
They have earned that.
Here's the thing. The league is overrated, Mark. At the same time, it's worthy of all the accolades it gets. All right.
I totally agree.
Because there's this idea that like the 7th place team in the SEC is so much better than the 7th place team in every other league. And it's not. Okay. It's not. Take away Alabama's bowl record, and especially when they're playing in games they care about as opposed to when they don't. And the rest of the SEC's resume looks an awful lot like the rest of every other league. Well, Steve, do the same thing with Ohio State. That's my point. Okay. So the league is clearly the standard we all are, the rest of us are measured by, and has earned that and should be. At the same time, the amount of propaganda and media narrative that goes to perpetuating this, particularly since ESPN became the league's corporate partner, is nauseating and has overrated the league at the same time. But don't let that get in the way of the fact that they are the standard. So I don't think that's arrogance at all. I would agree with that.
True and true. So, folks, I will be releasing at various times during the bowl season, putting some of these debates into context. And one will be the SEC versus the nation, and will be the SEC versus the Big Ten. So we'll put it into context. So that said, looking back at this matchup, Georgia, Michigan established as a sizable underdog at 8 points. Do you justify that? Do you think it's reasonable?
I think the number's high, especially given you have to throw in, we have the largest fan base in America. Okay. So the largest alumni base in America. And if it's not us, there's Notre Dame and Ohio State are the only two schools even in that conversation. So we always get a point or two in the line because of the amount of public action that comes in for us. What I find fascinating is that the line opened at 7 and it's already gone up. They're willing to take on additional risk. It reminded me of a couple of weeks ago when they were willing to take on, where everybody thought that Ohio State, myself included, was going to roll Michigan again. And they were fine taking all that Ohio State money that drove that number from 6.5 to 8. I think Georgia and Michigan are very, very similar. And I think they're similar in ways that Michigan and Iowa were similar, but Georgia just does a different level of recruiting than we do. However, we actually have competent quarterback play. Iowa's quarterback play is primordial ooze. We actually have, on any given down, athletes that can take you to the house with any kind of crease or angle. Iowa doesn't really. Tyler Goodson's a very good running back, but we're not talking, Ronnie Harmon, Tavian Banks kind of Iowa or Sean Green level of Iowa running back. He's pretty good, pretty good. But we're not talking about a guy that can carry a team. They tried to do that this year and they couldn't do that. I mean, our two quarterbacks, one's a 5-star and the other guy's got a career 19-4 touchdown to interception ratio. So while I would give the edge to Georgia because just overall they recruit at a different level, we're now getting into rarefied air here. Okay, so I guess most of our guys are 2nd and 3rd and 4th round picks, and most of their guys are 1st, 2nd, and 3rd picks. I mean, there's not, there's a gap of talent between Michigan and Georgia, but it ain't like the gap of talent between Michigan and Iowa, and with a similar style. Also, I think that Georgia was able to get ahead of teams, and tell me who's the great rushing team in the SEC East? Kentucky? They went away from that this year. They're playing more of an air raid. Tennessee? No, not with Josh Heupel there. Who's the team that will stubbornly stick to a run game and force you physically to play them straight up? Michigan will do that to its own fault. I mean, Michigan is not giving up on the run game. It won't. It might have a game plan similar to Wisconsin where it threw more on first down than in any other game this year. But the idea that Michigan's still not going to run the ball against Georgia 40 times New Year's Eve, regardless of the score, that's happening, brother. And so let's see, maybe they'll dominate us. I don't know, but let's see what happens when another team says, hey, we're going to play with our identity. Our guys were 4- and 5-star recruits too. So we're going to punch you in the mouth for 3 hours and see if you can stand up to that. And I don't know that Georgia's played a team that adds both the physicality, but then the explosiveness of athletes we have. And I've been telling you that we have a lot of very explosive athletes. Just a lot of them are young. The best days for this team from a talent perspective are actually in the next 2 classes. It may not end up being as good a team, who knows? But in terms of talent, the better players are actually in the freshman and sophomore classes. So, Georgia's playing a walk-on quarterback, and he's okay, but I don't know that he's any better than Cade McNamara is. I think this is a much closer matchup. I think it will be also both teams are going to come in here. And when you're playing in a playoff game and everybody's max lit, you're looking for any little edge. Georgia's manhood's going to feel very challenged, and they're going to have that chip on the shoulder. But Michigan's going to hear for 3 weeks, Mark, that they don't belong here. They're not any good. And boy, that just plays right into the MO of where this team is more comfortable. And the other thing too, that tell me who Georgia has played, because maybe no one has. I don't know that anybody in college football has what we have. Tell me who Georgia has played that on passing downs can drop 8 or drop 7 and think they can get pressure because they can of who they can bring off the edge. Georgia was able to basically neutralize Will Anderson, and I would kind of say him and Aiden Hutchinson are comparable. But who's Alabama's David Ojabo? One of the biggest plays of the game Saturday night, no one mentions, is we came out 3 and out. Iowa has a very good drive that they scripted going. They just missed a halfback pass that should have given them a touchdown. On the next play, Iowa has a pretty well blocked play. Ojabo blows that thing up on the edge all by himself, leads to a longer field goal, which Iowa misses. And that was kind of the settle down moment for Michigan. And they pretty much dominated the game from there. So we're going to bring some things to the table that that Georgia has not seen. This, from an explosion standpoint, this is not Michigan State or Notre Dame making the playoff. Those guys did not have Aiden Hutchinson, David Ojabos off the edge, Blake Corums, and Donovan Edwards in the backfield to go with a hammer like a Hassan Haskins. I don't think it's like that at all. And I also don't think this Georgia team is as explosive as the Alabama and Clemson teams that dominated Notre Dame and Michigan State in those playoff games either.
Those teams had Blake Corum wannabes, guys that came on campus with that kind of reputation, but they didn't prove it at the collegiate level and were not productive. I would say also that Clemson, in many aspects, is similar to Michigan. And of course, that was a 10-3 game. That was a 3-3 offensive stalemate, aside from a pick six, although Clemson's offensive line isn't anywhere close to Michigan's offensive line. And though they have a physically more gifted quarterback, he makes a ton of mistakes and doesn't know where he's going with the ball. And so there's a difference between Cade and DJ there.
The biggest worry I have in the game, Mark, is Michigan is not a team that has an obvious weakness. That doesn't mean it's elite everywhere, but it's competent to elite everywhere. But if there's one area where it's more competent than elite that I am concerned about, and I think you and I talked about this before the Ohio State game, Josh Ross is a downhill thumper. He's going to run 4.5 or something, 4.6 or something at the combine, which is really good for a middle linebacker. But like the short cone drills, lateral quickness, that ain't going to be his game. Okay. And the one thing I do worry about is the tight end there, Bowers, who's been phenomenal this year, and James Cook out of the backfield in space against our linebackers. Our best athletic linebackers are Nakai Hill Green and Junior Colson, and those guys are redshirt freshmen and true freshmen. And so you can't. We need James Ross's leadership and savvy on the field. But athletically, that's the area I am the most concerned about from a Michigan standpoint is Bowers and Cook in space against our linebackers.
Steve, Kirby Smart has obviously done just about everything right at Georgia. However, at the quarterback position, I'm thinking during this SEC championship game, I don't know that going into the game that Stetson Bennett has done anything on the field to be considered a lesser commodity than JT Daniels. Daniels has the 5-star ranking over Stetson Bennett, the 3-star walk-on, and I think that's what most people see when they see those two quarterbacks. But once they get into the action, all Kirby Smart has to do is go back to the 2017 game against Alabama, the 2018 game against Alabama, and see that his mentor pulled the trigger when they needed a reset. They needed a spark, not necessarily that Stetson Bennett was the problem, but that they needed something, and it worked for his mentor twice. I don't know that he's got it in him and that he's handling this situation correctly.
No, I agree with you on that. And now I don't know the internal chemistry of that team, and that the team just responds better to Stetson Bennett than it does to JT Daniels. This is a bit of a concern for me on the Michigan side of things, is that I think JJ McCarthy has the kind of skill set that neutralizes a lot of Georgia's defensive strengths. And from a recruit, he was just a notch below Bryce Young. I think he, though, is faster than Bryce Young and he's bigger than Bryce Young. And I think that the threat that he would add down to down, is it a pass? Is it a run? And I don't have to change looks at all. I can run formationally. I give you the same looks and you just don't know what is coming. I think we'd have a higher ceiling with him than with Cade, but it's a tricky wicket because Cade obviously is also one of the core leaders of the team. And so I'm somewhat sympathetic to Kirby Smart on that end, because he may face a similar thing. I mean, Bennett's been there for 5 years. Daniels transferred in. He's been hurt off and on, and Bennett's kind of been the constant there, and guys kind of rally around him. And so you're damned if you do and damned if you don't there if you're Kirby Smart. The other thing too, though, is yes, Jalen Hurts is a better runner than Tua Tagovailoa, but Tua ain't John Navarre statue back there either, right? In this case, it's rare that you take out the more dual function quarterback to put the statue in. Normally your changeup comes the other way around, right? And JT Daniels just doesn't have much mobility back there at all. And that's where I would be concerned, because he has not seen a lot of game action. We run a very multiple defense with a lot of different looks, similar to the Ravens, which is where our DC comes from. And I'd get concerned putting Daniels in there, and he's not very mobile, and he's got to take maybe another half second to process. And that's an extra half second for Ojabo and Hutchinson to wreck you on a particular down. So both of these teams have, for different reasons, have a bit of a roulette wheel at quarterback here.
But it's working for Michigan, so it's a much more steady roulette wheel, or what's coming. You either have the black or the red given to you, I guess, before it's spun, as opposed to the Georgia situation, where my thought there was everything that you just stated is valid. The keeping the locker room in check and knowing what move to make there is critical in that situation. I was thinking of it more in the moment. You're down by 2 scores.
Sure.
Let's make a change and see, because it's not getting done right now.
If not, and you do that for no other reason than if I need Daniels to win one of these next 2 games, he's already gotten his feet wet. I mean, the guy's not played any meaningful football since September. Okay. Now you want to throw him in against the number 1 or number 2 teams in the country in back-to-back weeks off the bench cold. I don't know. Good luck with that.
All hail Michigan. Thank you so much for the super chat contribution. I've replaced ESPN and put Mark Rogers in that spot. That's kind of ironic, actually. But anyway, love the content as always, and my Wolverines will win. I think you see more Jay and Edwards also. JJ Donovan Edwards. Absolutely. Steve Deace, Michigan Podcast. If you are not familiar, we've got about 600 people online. If you're not familiar, Steve Deace, Michigan Podcast, you've got to check out his work right here on YouTube or on your favorite audio platform. So please do that now. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by, and we will record the Michigan Podcast, of course, in which you are so kind to bring me on for a segment each and every week. I appreciate that.
You got it, brother. Merry Christmas to everybody. Go Blue. Good to see you, brother. Take care.